Okay, good morning. So I'm Mark Dumville, General Manager at Nottingham Scientific, and I'd like to take the opportunity to speak to you about threat detection and characterization across critical national infrastructures. So specifically, it's focusing on satellite navigation, GNSS, and specifically it's looking at RF threats. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the RAN for giving us this slot, and also the UK Space Agency for sponsoring it. And if I go on to the next slide, as in all good webinars, if you would like some additional reading, the topic of this is featured in GNSS Threat Monitoring and Reporting, Past, Present and a Proposed Future, which is a paper which was gladly accepted by the Royal Institute of Navigation and their Journal of Navigation. If you Google it, it is available there, but it gives a very detailed, very comprehensive overview of threat monitoring and reporting for GNSS. Okay, move on. So, with respect to GNSS threats and critical infrastructure. So, critical infrastructure, this is the definition of critical infrastructure. I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with it. There are 13 sectors. And what we have done within our work is we've tried to target most of them to actually deploy systems at these critical infrastructures in order to assess what types of threats, the kind of the signatures, the powers, the durations, the frequencies, any repeat patterns of at these specific sites, and in particular where GNSS is being used within these specific sites. I'll go into a little bit more detail as we progress through this webinar, and more details on critical national infrastructure is at the link shown. Okay, so you heard from Guy that threats are on the increase. So we've got in the Nordic countries, we've got instances in Moscow, we've got in the Middle East, we've got it in the Black Sea area, the Gulf area. We've also heard about instances where the one in the bottom right-hand corner is at Nantes Airport in France, where a GNSS jammer was left in a vehicle while the owner of the vehicle decided to jump onto a plane. And that resulted in Nantes Airport having to cease operations for 1 hour, 15 minutes, whilst it was actually tracked, located and confiscated. So things like that are actually making the news now, and obviously Guy mentioned the latest one with what's happening in Shanghai. So this is activity that is now complete. It's a year since the completion. However, it still carries on, such is the success of it. So there was a project. It was called STRIKE3, and that's what it stands for. Every good project needs a good acronym. It was funded by the European GNSS Agency under the H2020 framework program, and it was coordinated by NSL, our business. We had partners from the Swedish Defence Agency, the Finnish Land Survey Agency, from a test centre in Germany, and from the Catapults in the UK, and also partners, international partners from India and from Korea. And it was all about understanding the threats to GNSS. So there were lots and lots of reports about threats, but there was no real quantifiable evidence of what these things are, how frequent they are, the types, the severities, the impacts, and so forth. So that was the logic, the objective behind it. It started in beginning of February in 2016 and finished last January. But as I say, it's still continuing. The work's still continuing. So in summary, what we actually did was take our equipment and deploy it at sites, CNI sites around the world. So in partnership with some of the hosting entities. And that equipment was deployed, so antennas, detection equipment. Inside the detection equipment, we have got specific RF chains to monitor the interference, as well as a commercial off-the-shelf GNSS receiver, so we could identify what the impact of detecting a threat or seeing a threat was on the GNSS receiver, as well as then separately with our RF chain, actually recording it, examining it, processing it, and so forth. So they were doing the world at different locations, different critical infrastructures, and all of the data was stored on a server where the data can also be characterized, so we can detect whether or not it's an unintentional interference, or whether it's a deliberate jammer, or whether it's something perhaps a little more mischievous, a bit more sinister. And then the logic, so that's the division of the project, but the logic was that if we've actually got this database, it's a bit like virus, antivirus, that we actually understand what the threats are, we can actually then develop the countermeasures, the mitigation techniques in order to protect GNSS services. So the two big deliverables in all of that were a draft standard for threat reporting. So we have got our equipment, but other vendors have their own equipment. And what we would like is to develop a standard whereby systems can all report into the same databases. So potentially you could have, let's say the UK has got its own database from different vendors, or perhaps international aviation has got its own database, or maritime transport has got its own database. So it would allow different vendors, different systems to report in. So that was one of the standards that we developed, and it has been, I would say, largely adopted. So there's lots of activities that are actually implementing that standard. And then the other standard, which was critically important and perhaps links in with the discussions that we've been having about risk earlier in the earlier presentations, is for testing GNSS receivers and GNSS equipment. So how do you, once you actually understand the threat, how do you then take that threat and inject it into GNSS equipment and services and assess the impact, and coming up with thresholds for acceptance and so forth, and understanding the vulnerability of GNSS-based equipment. So that they were the two, but the big activity was to deploy the network and extract or develop this database. So what we wanted to do was to set out with some guiding principles. So first of all, that what we are trying to do is to make GNSS stronger, harder, the backbone of position, navigation and timing. We are not about over-exaggerating or influencing. It is just fact-finding this. We are also not regulators. We're a commercial business and we've got partners there. We do not do the regulatory function, so we're not involved in any way of enforcement with respect to these interferences that we detect. We did not attempt to locate anything, albeit we could have. We didn't. And all of the data is anonymized, so you will not see which countries scored high, which ones were, and so forth. You'll see which countries we deployed at, and you'll see general results. The data is anonymized, and there's very good reasons for that. But I think since the project, I think more people now are open to discussing what they actually saw, what they do see, the continues to see. So there is kind of an open disclosure that's actually came out of this project. As I mentioned, everything is at critical national infrastructure sites. So the global network. So here are the countries. United Kingdom, Sweden, Finland, and Germany. So they were project partners along with India. But as you can see, a good stretch of them. We've got Canada, New Zealand in there, and Japan. Predominantly European project. It's about understanding what is actually happening in Europe. With respect to the United Kingdom, Sweden, Finland, and Germany, there were more stations deployed in those countries because that's the project partners, whereas there were one or two in the other countries. And for those deployments, at a minimum, we kept them there for 3 months. At a maximum, we kept them there for 24 months, actually getting into 36 months as well. So there was a very comprehensive data set that we've actually developed. And here are some of the infrastructures. So major city centres on top of buildings. I'll come on to the stakeholders that were involved, but city ring roads, road tolling. So GNSS-based road tolling is quite a large, quite an increasing activity within Europe and other countries. So yeah, people are trying to deceive GNSS-based equipment on road tolling. Airports, there was a large focus on airports, and that has been reported into ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, into some of their working groups. Also, they're trying to see what actually happens with GNSS infrastructure. So where GNSS receiver equipment is located, already located, actually co-locating it with some of our detection equipment. GBAS, this is the landing system, the GNSS landing system for airports. So we did deploy next to there, next to some of those installations, power stations, and in particular the substations, and there were several installations within the UK with known entities in the UK relating to power. Railways, border crossings, which was quite interesting. So Europe has several borders, so putting on there and seeing what comes into Europe, what goes out of Europe. Ports, we also installed on a vessel as well. And on the vessel, we actually detected events even when the vessel was at sea. So coming from the shore, we managed to get onto a bank, and there were a whole host of other sites that we deployed, and it was the antenna, the cabling, the actual equipment. But like I said, then all the data came to into the database. And the stakeholders, the usual, I guess, government agencies, transport agencies, civil aviation, service providers, port authorities, shipping, railways, frequency operators. Although we were not doing the job of the frequency regulator, we tried to ensure we established a contact with the frequency regulator, because they're obviously interested on what is on their patch. There were some military people involved, national mapping agencies, and so forth. And on the whole, it really did stir up a scene. It got people talking about it, talking openly about it, and many of the results were actually presented at their own working groups and task forces and so forth. So I'll get on to some of the results now. So the big thing was the equipment. And what does the equipment do? It persistently monitors 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, GNSS frequency band. In particular, it was the L1 only, so L1 and for GPS and D1 for Galileo. It is plus or minus 8 megahertz of the center frequency of GPS L1 and Galileo E1. So 1575 megahertz plus or minus, so plus 8 megahertz, minus 8 megahertz. And that, if you look on the graphs on the bottom, that is where you've got the red kind of power plots, that is the bandwidth of it. And then if you look at the blue, if you tip that on its side, that is the bandwidth, and this is time. The x-axis now is time, and the color is power. So if we actually look at the red in the bottom right, the red sign, you can actually see this is the bandwidth, this is power, and you can see that the jammer in this instance is actually putting power into the center of that bandwidth, which is denying GNSS and Galileo. So what the equipment does is generate those plots. And what we actually found, one of the really big findings of the project, was that most jammers and the way that they are used have got unique characteristics. So we can actually fingerprint them. And certainly we can fingerprint to a level whereby we can easily detect whether or not it's unintentional interference, whether it's a deliberate jammer, and potentially the sophistication of that jammer, and indeed whether or not it's another type of signal. So just show you some of the few fingerprints, and you can see a few examples of the spectrum and spectrograms, as they're called. You will see a lot more as we move through this presentation, but I hope you get a feeling for what the ability is of the equipment, because then you can start seeing whether or not it's the same interferent happening all the time, the same jammer happening all the time, or whether or not it's a whole varied set of jammers, because dealing with these issues is really dependent on understanding what threats you're experiencing. And then the back analytics, the back office analytics. So we've got the spectrum, we also have got power, we've got the effect on the number of satellites, we've got the effect on the positioning. Another big finding was that interferences and jammers jam, but also they cause positioning errors and timing errors. And we've got the analytics tools of being able to do the trends and the patterns and so forth. So this is the project dates are there. This is the findings. These are the findings. So 500,000 of interference events throughout that monitoring campaign, of which we see there that there's 69,000 of them right in the middle in red is chirp. That's take that as jammer, but you can see that the rest of it, the majority of them are not actually jams. It's interference. GNSS spectrum is messy. There's white noise, wideband, there's narrowband, there's single tones, there's some structured interferences. So this is the orange, the CDMA. So they look like a communications type signal. And there is a lot of junk in the frequency bands that we need to be aware of, and they're not all deliberate jammers. In terms of durations, we see a lot of them are greater than 5 minutes. So the majority of them are kind of 30 seconds, give or take, less than 30 seconds rather. There's 5,000 greater than 5 minutes. There are 1,000 greater than 30 minutes, 500 greater than an hour, 9 events greater than 1 day, and the largest event being 14 days. 14 days of GNSS interference. Interesting. So we've now got a picture of the durations. We've got a picture of the powers. We then move on to actually assess the impacts of them. So this pie chart is kind of a decomposition of those 556,000 events. And what it does is separate it. So the blue is the unintentional interferences. The pink or the red is the deliberate jammers. So that's how they've been split. And then you have that overlap in the middle, which are those events that affected the GNSS receiver that is inside of our equipment. And as you can see, the impact on the receiver was only 5%. Out of all of those, the receiver was only impacted 5%. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we will come on to, but the quality of the receiver, the signal strength of the interference, the type of the interference, and the within the receiver itself, whether it's got mitigation measures built in. There's a variety of reasons, but that's what we found. But nevertheless, the fact that we found, I think it's 69,000 jammers, means that it perhaps wasn't jamming where we detected it, but it would have been jamming something where it was actually being used. And here we get back to our fingerprints of those interferences that did not deny GNSS, but they are interferences, unintentional interferences. And as you can see, a plethora of them. So I mentioned that the reason why they didn't deny is because they're a long distance away from where our detection equipment was. The actual power of them, which may be related to distance, but it could be low power at a short distance or large power at a long distance. And the receiver and local factors, so shielding and so forth. But there are some of the fingerprints that we detected that didn't deny GNSS. And here are those interferences, and again, interferences, not jammers, that denied GNSS. Now, I need to qualify this here. We believe that some of these signatures are actually from jammers, but we haven't seen this type of jammer physically as a product. So we can't kind of hand on heart say that they are jammers, but they look like them, they do the job, they're centered right on, as you can see, that there's several of them that are actually pointed right on top of that center frequency of GPS and Galileo on L1 and E1. So they do the job, but we can't, because we haven't actually been able to see a product and profile a product, we can't actually say that they are jammers. But they are the interferences that denied the GNSS signals. And then these are the jammers. So some of them, obviously, but you can see that there's a lot of variability in them. They do the job, and 7,000 of them actually denied GNSS. And again, it could be a very high power jammer from a distance, or it could be a low power jammer that was very close up to our detection equipment, just went past it. But it did the job, it denied GNSS. But you can see the different types of signatures, which then gets very interesting in if there is one of those signatures that is continuous, that we're seeing continuously. We can start building up a pattern database and even predicting when that jammer is next likely to occur at that particular site. And then these are the jammers that didn't deny GNSS. So they would have denied GNSS somewhere, but not at where it was received, where it was detected with our equipment, largely because of the distance, the power of where they were actually operating. But we've got them all collected there in the database and logged. And in doing so, we actually detect a lot of new jammers that are appearing. So what we have seen in particular is a new form of jammer that we'd never seen before, and we saw it at a few sites, and then it started coming out into a greater number of sites. So we can actually see how fast a jammer can actually be created, and then, if you like, the jammer industry, how it can actually propagate, be sold as a product. So that's interesting. But you can actually see with these jammer waveforms that somebody out there is actually putting some effort into doing things differently in comparison to the previous ones, which are kind of the classical chirps. There is more intricacy into these type of waveforms. Right, and then I guess one of the findings, kind of post project, is that we actually believe we've detected a spoofer in the wild. We believe that we've detected somebody building a spoofer in the wild. So if I start off with the January 2019, we saw a signal that was just a kind of a single tone continuous wave at very high power at one of our sites. That's interesting. Okay, let's look at it again. Never really came back, but then we saw a CDMA, so a structured waveform appear that was very, very high power. So that got quite interesting. And we've seen that, yeah, again. What is interesting is if we go back to January, that the receiver inside of our equipment has got the ability to remove that. So you have a 2-meter positioning error. It's been able to remove that signal. When it comes to the one in August, we're still getting a 2-meter, but you can see it's a tighter 2-meter spread. When you come to September, suddenly that jumps out, the position error is 150 kilometers. So it is our belief that the August one is actually, there are spoof signals that are actually putting it at its right location, at the proper location. The 2-meter one is actually the GNSS receiver giving its own receiver. And then the 150 kilometer one is actually where the spoofer has actually came in and it has moved the location. So just gives you a sense of the power of what we're wishing to do. So in summary, threat monitoring network, we've got the network out there. It is been collecting. We're now running up to about 1 million events, and the standards have been developed. There is a website, I hope it's still operational, that has got access to more documents. I gave the reference before as well. Just to finish off a little bit, that I would just like to say that the UK has invested a lot in this. They understand the dependency, the criticality of GNSS, and they understand the threats and vulnerabilities to it. So we are really, really well prepared. And for the reader, I include the references. And there are things happening in the UK. We have got a skeleton network up and running, doing stuff in the UK, and we're looking to elaborate that in order to get a better sense of what are these events at critical national infrastructures within the UK. On that note, I would like to say thank you for your attention. Hope you've enjoyed it, and any questions, I'll be around later to answer them. Thank you very much.